Hello, and welcome back to the Detours in Music podcast. I'm Laura Rupel, and today we're on episode 23, which features JMU professor of tuba and euphonium, Kevin Stees. Enjoy.
Well, I'm Kevin Stees, and I'm the tuba euphonium professor at JMU, and I've been there for 35 years now, just slightly longer than your dad,
Yep.
just only a couple years longer. And I teach, as I mentioned, teach tuba and euphonium, and I conduct the brass band.
Great. Can you talk about how you started out in music?
Sure. I started playing the tuba when I was 10. So the instrument was definitely larger than I was at that point. My mom or my dad had to help me carry it to and from rehearsals and concerts and things. I had a stand that went with it, and
Mhm.
it was a lot. But I started in fifth grade, and it was one of those things where you go to the band room and you get to pick the instrument you want. And as is probably the case with others that you've talked to, I was not intending on playing tuba
Mm.
when I got in there, but they needed someone to play. And they said, well, who would be interested in this? And I, for some strange reason, raised my hand. And that's where I ended up. At the same time, my brother, who's a year older, he was in sixth grade. He started on euphonium the same year that I started tuba. So we were both in the same class.
Okay.
And then my dad plays the trombone. So it was kind of cool because we would, I mean, right from the beginning, he was kind of helping us learn how to play. And I mean, I never thought of practicing when I was a kid at home because my dad just always played with us. So I was probably playing my horn an hour every day from the time I was like, you know, 11. So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Was
So
your real introduction to music the band program?
yeah, that was really what it was, because at first I played in the band in elementary school and in middle school. Where I went to school, it was a 7-8 middle school, or they called it intermediate school at the time. And I didn't do any playing in an orchestra until I was in high school. At my high school, there was an orchestra, a high school orchestra. And then I would play in sort of a regional group. It wasn't like a regional orchestra that you audition, but it was a private regional group, and it's now um, the orchestra that's the youth orchestra in the Northern Virginia area, the National Youth
Okay.
Philharmonic or whatever it was, if that's what it's called, something like that. But at that point, it was the Northern Virginia Youth Symphony that I played with, and I played with them a couple seasons, and that's when I first found out you have to sit a lot and count measures of rest a lot.
Hmm.
But I really like doing it. But yeah,
Yeah.
that was, yeah,
When was your transition of this is something I do for fun, and then this is something I might want to do forever?
yeah, forever. We always say that, don't we? I think by the time I was in middle school, I really had, I mean, I think I played pretty well as a middle schooler comparatively. And I do think that even at that point, I kind of had feelings that I enjoyed it enough that I would like to do this professionally. Certainly by the time I was in high school, I was taking lessons from professionals in the area, and growing up around DC, you had all the military band musicians that you could work with. So I first started taking lessons from Robert Palanche, who was the principal tuba in the United States Army Band in Pershing, or not Pershing Zone, yeah, Pershing Zone. And I worked with him for a couple of years, and then I switched over and took lessons from Jack Tilbury, who was another tuba player in the band and also was in the Army Brass Quintet. And it was probably during that time dealing with those guys, moving from eighth grade into high school, that I had a pretty good idea that that's what I was really interested in doing. Now, as a high schooler, you don't know what you want to do in music. You just know you want to study music. So,
Yeah.
yeah, but that's where I ended up with it. So it was about that point.
Okay. Um, where did you go to attend school for your undergrad?
Undergraduate school, it was interesting when I was applying or looking at schools. Jack Tilbury, that I studied with, he was basically said, look, there's three places you should consider going. And he said, you should either go to Indiana and study with Harvey Phillips, or go to Tennessee Tech and study with Winston Morris, or you should go to the University of Illinois and study with Dan Parentoni. And because at that point, really, and this is, I graduated high school in 1979. the number of actual full-time tuba teachers, I mean, there were a good number around, but it wasn't like anybody would experience now. It's like you could go to almost any four-year college and there will be someone teaching. And at that point, it was really a much smaller list of schools that had full-time professors. And then of all the ones that were teaching, to find the people who were really kind of actively involved in concertizing as soloists and chamber musicians. So I ended up going to the University of Illinois, and that's in Urbana-Champaign in Illinois, and was there for 4 years. And I studied, actually, when I was there, I studied music education, because that was, you basically could be a performance major or you could be a music education student, unless you were going to study composition, which wasn't my thing. And Mr. Parentoni, my teacher, was basically said, "You're going to study music education." I was like, okay, because he was really interested in people having, he used to call it having enough bases covered when you got out of school that you could make a living in the music profession. You know, certainly I don't know that he talked about whether a person wanted to teach public school music, you know, because we would all hate to think of a high school band director that didn't want to do that. It's like, what a worse place could you be? But I think he maybe probably sensed that I would have enjoyed teaching in some capacity. But it was interesting while I was there that the, you know, by the time I was in maybe my junior year, taking all those extensive methods courses, conducting and band director, you know, management of, you know, that kind of stuff, I, in the back of my mind, knew that this was not going to be what I was going to do. And it wasn't because of my distaste for doing that at all. As a matter of fact, I still think I could have enjoyed that, but I think I found, playing wise, that I was becoming more successful at that, and was probably more interested in trying to have pursuits that had more to do with playing my instrument, which of course would either be some sort of performing ensemble or college teaching, kind of a career path at that point.
What was your next step after graduating?
When I left Illinois, then I was intent on then applying for my graduate, you know, master's work. And there, you know, I had studied with Mr. Parentoni actually only for 3 of my 4 years, because he actually ended up leaving, if you could imagine, my senior year. He moved and started teaching at Arizona State.
Okay.
So, so I only got to have him for 3 years, work with him for 3 years. So I was looking at schools, and one of the places that I was really interested in at that point was Michigan, because at that point, Abe Torchinsky, who used to play in the Philadelphia Orchestra, he was retired from the Philadelphia Orchestra, and he was kind of nearing his tenure, his time at Michigan. I was like, this is my chance to, you know, like one of the big names. And I went to Ann Arbor and did that audition. And I may have also, if I remember, and it's hard to remember now, I think I also auditioned again at Indiana. But then, in the meantime, Mr. Parentoni, my undergraduate teacher, having just gotten into his position, finally acquired an assistantship at Arizona State. And so, you know, this is one of these things where you tell a story and then people think, well, you had it easy, whatever. But I literally had a scenario where he called me, and I hadn't auditioned for him again. He just called me and he said, "I have this assistantship. Do you want it?" And I was like, "Yeah, I do." Because, you know, any other place, it wasn't as though I was necessarily thinking I wanted to study with him for yet 2 more years, although that would have only been 5. But I think the idea of having an assistantship that was guaranteed, and it was also because it was I was really the first full-time assistant he had. He really kind of let me do almost anything you could imagine being able to do. So I ended up there for 2 years, and because he knew me and I knew him, we didn't have that breaking in period. You know, you have a new master's student come in, it takes you like a year to figure out who they are until you can really trust what they're going to do. And he already knew me, and he, you know, right from the start, he said, "You're going to have 4 students, and, you know, do this orchestral repertoire class with these freshman tuba players, and coach this quintet, and teach the low brass, or the tuba euphonium part of brass techniques."
That is a lot.
It was tons. I mean, I got so, and admittedly, you know, moving on from there, because I don't have another degree. My master's degree was the last degree that I pursued. that I don't think would it have not have been for him having me do as much, I don't think I would have ended up getting a job as young as I got a job, because I had 2 years of as much experience as many like 3/4 time faculty members might have had.
Yeah.
It was a weird yet really wonderful scenario. It's very, very unique to have that happen,
Yeah, definitely.
that you're given that much leeway. I mean, the funny thing is I worked in this orchestral repertoire class, and there was a tuba player whose name is Steve Rosset, and Steve is now the principal tuba in the Sydney Symphony in Australia. So it's really cool to see all the stuff he's done, and it's always fun every time he sees me and we're around other people. He always tells everyone I taught him all the excerpts that he knows, and I'm like, no, you could definitely teach me a few more now. So
Cool.
yeah, it's really neat, really neat.
Were there some things that you struggled with in your undergraduate degree that you maybe see other students struggle with, or?
So with struggling, do you mean in terms of actual playing wise, or just being a music major?
It can be either.
I think for me, the things that I excelled at, I think defined the things that I did not, probably.
Okay.
I think music history and literature, I feel like I have a pretty good sense of musical memory in terms of just learning literature. I still, I listened to a lot of music as a high school student, a lot of classical, a lot of concert music as a high school student.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that helped me a lot getting into college and just going through the literature classes.
Mm-hmm.
For me, form and analysis classes were kind of fun, but just straight up music theory was not so much fun for me.
Yeah.
That was probably the biggest struggle for me. And not that I couldn't do it and even do it fairly well, but it's just that it was probably outside of what my biggest interest area was. And I tend to be someone that if I'm not as interested, I really have to push myself to kind of get into it. You kind of realize the value of it. And so you want to do it and learn as much as you can for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
But, it's not like my son Ryan, just like, he just understands that stuff so well. And as a composer, that's just sort of down, right up, with what he likes to do.
Yeah.
That was probably the biggest thing I struggled with as a music major overall. I think playing wise, I was kind of in there with everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
I had pretty good success as an undergraduate student, I would say, in terms of auditioning for things. There's always the transition as for tuba players that you oftentimes in U.S. Colleges are going to end up switching what key of tuba you play, and this is very geeky, just tuba stuff, but you're going to switch from an instrument that's pitched in B flat to an instrument that's pitched in C. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty commonplace. And that was probably one of the scariest things I had to do, because, my teacher would tell me, well, you're going to hate this for a while, and it'll probably take you about a month, and then you'll get it. And then you won't be able to sight read anything for about 6 months very well, because you kind of learn it and you move along. And that was probably one of the more challenging things, was just kind of feeling comfortable on a brand new instrument with completely different fingerings and,
mm-hmm.
And right in the midst of being in college, here's this new horn, now go learn that.
Yeah. That's just kind of a rite of passage for tuba players.
It really is. And most universities with music majors, not just students who are in music as a minor, but most US schools, students will end up learning C, and that kind of is that rite of passage. Now, more people now come in and are playing on a different instrument like that, playing on a C tuba. But when I was in school, that was not very common for freshmen to come in knowing how to do that. So it was like I auditioned as a freshman and was placed in the symphonic band, which at Illinois, they had the big style symphony band. So it was like almost 100-piece band. You did all these transcriptions, these amazing, really great transcriptions. And that was the top band that Harry Bejan conducted that band. And so I sat in a section, you have a tuba section of 6 players.
Yeah.
And I was sitting like, 4th chair or something like that. So, I was, as a freshman, that's a pretty good feat. And then Mr. Parentoni, the way that they worked, it had some influence with how they would audition things. So there, you basically did your first audition, and then you just got placed after that. You didn't have to keep re-auditioning. It was
Yeah.
it was sort of it wasn't really seniority. It was just like, did the conductor like you and trust you? And
Yeah.
so as soon as I switched to C, Mr. Parentoni just told him, just move him down to last chair.
Yeah.
So I was one semester, I was fourth chair, and the next semester I was at the very bottom.
Yeah. It's like, you should still be there, but.
Exactly, but now you're going to have to work. But then the cool thing is then I came back, and then the next semester he places me principal. So,
Yeah.
that was a pretty interesting thing to have happen within, a 2-year period, especially with that studio, because there were a lot of great players in there.
When you got your master's degree, were you looking for a collegiate job after that, do you think?
I was not necessarily looking for that. I think I do know that halfway through my master's degree, the one thing I knew as a performer I was not going to do was I was not then interested in playing in a military band.
Okay.
And I have no issue with anybody playing in. As a matter of fact, I encourage my students. I have several students who have done that, who are doing it currently. But there was something for me that I thought, with the path that I felt like I was going to be moving on, that kind of career was probably not where I was going to go. So in all the auditions I took, I think I auditioned for one military band, which was the U.S. Air Force Band. Obviously didn't get the, or have just retired from the Air Force Band. But I took 6 or 7 professional orchestra auditions as well. So I was auditioning for anything from the Pittsburgh Symphony, Alabama Symphony. I got to sit on the stage at Symphony Hall or Orchestra Hall in Chicago, because I auditioned for the Chicago Symphony.
Oh.
I know it sounds impressive.
Really
I think it's more impressive than it sounds more impressive than it really is, because that was an open audition. So they just put you on stage. So it was cool enough just to.
Still a good experience.
And some I was very successful in terms of advancing. And some was that typical thing where you drive for 12 hours and you play for 5 minutes, and then they say thank you very much, and you get in your car and you drive for another 12 hours and go home.
Yeah.
So I had a lot of that. And then in the meantime, as I was moving toward the end of my master's degree, then when it came up at that point about looking at university jobs, and to me, it was sort of on an even par with getting an orchestra job or be at a university. I didn't really set out to have one or the other. I just knew I thought I would enjoy either one. I felt like with the orchestra job, you are tied to your schedule, but you have a lot of musical freedom. As compared to being in the military, I suppose, with some of the things that you have to do and more regimented. And I also thought the university job would provide maybe not symphonic playing, but would provide a lot of leeway for chamber music stuff, which I had been really involved in a lot of brass quintet playing in my career as a student and as a sort of professional, semi-professional player. So I knew that I would have that available. And then I like, solo playing. So to me, that seemed, at least in the playing arena, those both look good. And then I knew that from, being in my master's program, that I enjoyed the coaching and the teaching and that. So, that really kind of points you in that direction a little bit, to know that, maybe that's something that you could enjoy doing as well.
Yeah. I'm curious, because I'm not positive, but was JMU your first job?
This has been my only job.
Yeah, my dad is the same way. So.
Yeah. And I finished my master's degree when I was 23. And so I was hired here when I was 23.
Goodness.
I think that there's a combination of things that when you look back, it makes you feel really good that, you feel like, well, I must have been doing something okay. Something must have been working out for me. But I also know that it proved the point that if you have some good connections, particularly with Dan Parentoni, who I was studying with at the time, that he was able to make connections with people at JMU. At that point, it was Pat Rooney, who was the director of bands, and they kind of connected. I think it was at the Midwest Band Clinic, and Pat talked to Dan Parentoni, and like, we have this job opening, what do you think? And Dan's Parentoni's the type that when he has someone, he will just, like, if you're the next one in line of his students, he's going to go all in, and he's like, absolutely. I think it was I think Pat Rooney tells me the story that Dan said, "You'll be a fool if you don't hire this guy." So,
Yeah.
and that's a Mr. Parentoni kind of thing to say,
Yeah.
throwing
You're
it
like,
out
oh,
there.
really me?
Yeah, yeah, and it's really cool that way. So there was this job open, and then I also had two other places I applied. One was University of South Carolina, and the other one was University of Wisconsin at Madison. Those
Okay.
were all the three jobs that were open. And
Yeah.
the thing for me that kind of really narrowed it down was both of the other schools, even though they were not going to really be interested in me, I still applied. And the reason being is that they required a doctorate.
Mm.
But I still applied. Parentoni was like, just apply, see,
Yeah.
see what happens.
Yeah.
I think I had, interest at both of those schools, but it was sort of the, oh, I'm sorry, we wished we could, but
Hmm.
this is the way we're looking at things here. So,
Do you think if you hadn't gotten the job at JMU, you would have pursued your doctorate?
yeah, I would have. I think I was, as a matter of fact, I was already looking at that,
Mm.
places to go at that point. But sometimes when you're 23, you don't think as far ahead as you think.
Yeah.
You know,
I just want a job.
I mean, it is that way, or you're thinking, well, at the point that I applied for the job here, I was married. I had gotten married. Mrs. Stees and I got married midway through our graduate work because she was
Okay.
at Arizona State. And so we got married after our first year. And then she worked at a public school as a music teacher and finished up part-time. And then I had an assistantship, which was also income.
Hmm.
So I think after that, who knows, we could have ended up living around Phoenix for a while. And then I could have been applying for other performing jobs or, it's almost hard to imagine now after this many years
Yeah,
being any different than it is now.
exactly.
Yeah.
I guess you weren't, that I know of, put in a position to doubt if you were going to continue to be a musician. But were there moments in your life where you thought of other career paths?
Well, that's it's a funny question, but it's a good question because it's not doubting, but there are some times where I'd have to have contingency plans.
Mhm.
So while I was here, I was hired as a full-time faculty member, but it was not a tenure track contract. In other words, it was a 5-year contract, and then it was a 5-year non-renewable contract, which is something that a university might use if they were hiring young math professors or something. I'm going to bring you in for 5 years, give you some experience. Now you can go out into the greater world and get a job someplace else so that they can kind of keep their salary price point as low as possible.
Yeah.
Well, I was hired at instructor rank, which is much lower than anybody else normally would be hired. Normally it's assistant professor. And the idea here was that they would likely try and convert my contract to a tenure track contract, which would be good because then I could then apply for tenure and then I would be here. But in the time that I was first hired till when this year came up that this would happen, the dean of the college changed.
Mm.
And the new dean was like, we're not converting anything. If this becomes a tenure track contract, Kevin Stees, you're going to have to apply again for your job. So after being here for 5 years, I had to go through a second national search for my position.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the point, per your question, where I wasn't doubting things, but I wasn't necessarily doubting that I would be here, but you don't know, don't know, and so I applied for a job at University of Southern Mississippi. Of all places, I don't want to live in Mississippi necessarily, be really far away from family and things like that. So that was kind of my contingency at that point in time.
Mm-hmm.
And so we did a national search. They brought people on campus, they auditioned them and interviewed them, and I had to go through the whole thing. I mean, I literally had to teach my own students in front of everybody and conduct my own ensemble and that kind of stuff. And luckily, it worked out. I had already had 5 good years of reviews, so it was kind of hard pressed for people maybe to not want to hire you again. And then I ended up never interviewing for the other job because I knew that I was more interested in staying here at JMU. So that was probably the one point in my career where I wondered, am I going to go get my doctorate now because I'll have this time if I don't get rehired, or am I going to be moving to Mississippi or moving someplace else to
Yeah.
pursue a career at a different university?
Interesting.
Yeah.
What are some things that you hear yourself saying to a lot of your students, like advice that's either common or problems you see all of us struggling with?
Yeah. I think I think in 35 years of teaching, I think I teach differently now than I did 35 years. I think I would almost say I think I was a little meaner when I was younger.
Mm-hmm.
I really do. And I don't think it's an issue of standards. I think it's an issue of your disposition.
Mm.
It's like you come in and you're young and you want to kind of prove yourself.
Yeah.
And I think, in all this time though, just, regardless of what personality I was sort of using at that point, I feel like I'm more myself now than I was probably in the first 10 years of teaching, that I most want students to understand that what they're studying is music first, and that I like dealing with the individual and the musician first, who happens to be playing a 30-pound hunk of metal that we call a tuba, or a 20-pound hunk of metal we call a euphonium. I think I try with everybody to get them to understand that music study has to be you studying yourself in a way as a musician, and that you're trying to learn your craft on a certain instrument and techniques only to enable you to do what you should be doing as a musician more easily. But that the craft of the instrument, the brass craft, if you will, the tuba craft, doesn't necessarily guarantee great music making. It could guarantee the best sound in the world, but it doesn't guarantee an actual musician.
Yeah.
And that's probably the thing for all my students. And that's a carryover from my study with Mr. Parentoni, is that, we had to do a write-up about him after he had taught 25 years or whatever it was, some kind of, thing honoring his time teaching. And I remember I was asked to write something, and I told him, I said, my one story I remember was my first lesson, where I came in and, it was like, "You doing okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine." And I'd play a little bit, and he just stopped me and says, what do you want to do? It's like he didn't really know me, so he's just trying to get to know me. And I said, "Well, I want to be a tuba player. I want to be a professional tuba player." And he was like, "I don't teach tuba players. I teach musicians." And you were like, "What?" And it stuck with me. And I think that I don't just try and imitate that concept, but that I sort of have internalized it myself, and that I believe in all my teaching that that's what we're trying to do at the crux of it, because we can get very hung up about specifics of our instrument craft all the time. I know for you, I'm sure, with Reed, I know how it can be, with my wife being an oboe player, and we can get hung up about all sorts of things, but ultimately it's looking at practicing and performing as you revealing some artistic side of yourself using this medium, rather than it being just that I have to perfect this medium. Because to me, that's boring. After 35 years, I don't really like teaching tuba lessons, but I like giving music lessons of people who happen to be playing the tuba. But, I have a lot of students who ask me to coach them who don't even play tuba. It might be other brass players. I've had some woodwind players ask me, that kind of thing. And I enjoy doing that. So that's probably the biggest thing that I like my students to know, and that I say a lot throughout, because we do tons of singing in their lessons, because I'm trying to figure out if they can actually carry a tune as a musician. Not are they a good singer, but can they be expressive on their own, and I find that to be the most important and most telling thing that we could do, is to be able to have that sense of self-expression regardless of what I'm playing, sort of beside the point.
That's really interesting, because I think I've approached lessons basically the opposite way. And I think with oboe lessons, I've heard a lot of times people say, "Oh, we're going to work on how to master this, instrument so that you can be more expressive and everything." So I think for me, it would almost be harder to go the other way, because I don't know all the time what it is that I want to be saying with my music necessarily.
Right. Yeah, and I have my students, and high school students I've worked with, college students I've worked with, ensembles I've directed, where
Mm.
people, I think we can get very technically oriented. And I think that if we want to be professional musicians, we have to also understand, and this is probably the other thing, is that, getting good at something is oftentimes more a commitment of time than it is anything else. And assuming that you're doing things in a reasonable way, you just have to be willing to put the time in.
Yeah.
And that's more of Pat Sheridan, who's a tuba soloist, more of a quote of his than anybody
Yeah.
else. As he says, the key to great improvement is more of a commitment of time than anything. And I do require that my students have to do the basic fundamentals, the mundane skills, the behind the scenes stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I try and convince them to know that when you're on stage, no one cares whether you played out of your Arbin trumpet book or whatever technical studies or whatever scales. They're really not interested. They're interested in you revealing something of yourself and the story that you're trying to tell as a musician.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've heard a lot of really great tuba players. I mean, better tuba players than I.
Yeah.
For sure. That I didn't always find what they said to be as good as their actual playing. And if only they could tell a great story, they would have it.
Yeah.
Now does it make it easier? Does it maybe open you up to being able to tell a better story? Sure it does.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't have a great story, just playing an instrument well does not.
Yeah.
It's sort of like I tell my students, I can really get dressed up and buy a brand new custom made suit and that kind of thing, but it doesn't mean my conversation is going to be very good.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the thing is, what am I trying to say? And it's almost like maybe dealing with the idea that if I have this musical concept in front of me, the story I'm wanting to tell, and if I can flesh that out mentally or maybe by singing it,
Mm-hmm.
then all those things you mentioned that you work on a lot as an oboist,
Mm-hmm.
those are kind of driven because of this really high ideal musically that you have. It's like, it's like either saying, I'd like to play this concerto, even just saying a piece of music. Well, yeah, but to play that concerto, you better really be good at scales and thirds or chromatics or,
Yeah.
ridiculously wide leaps or, so, but it's not just the technique in the piece, but it's being able to say what you want to be able to say freely and as musically as possible. To me, that drives what I'm going to practice as a tuba player.
Yeah.
So it's like putting the music first and then developing the skills to get there, rather than developing skills and go, okay, now what do you want me to do? Kind of that way.
That makes perfect sense, I think.
Yeah, that's cool. Good. Well, there you go. I like that.
Are there any moments in your life you can look back and say, like, that was a detour in my musicianship or in career? I mean,
well, it's funny. It's like you said with your dad, this was his first job. So here we are. So it's like, okay, I'm one of these people that doesn't have as interesting a story, I think, as some where they did like 7 different things. One of them was, I worked in a shoe store, and then I didn't have to do that. And I feel very blessed and fortunate for where I've been. But the thing that's probably the biggest detour, but it's not moving away. You think of a detour as moving away from something and going into something else. To me, the biggest detour or fork in the road of parallel roads, something that I have to do simultaneously, is the amount of conducting that I do.
Okay.
And some people now professionally know me more as a conductor than they know me as a tuba player. And I, as a music ed student, took conducting classes. We had, 3 semesters worth of stuff, and it was pretty intensive that we had. And I never assumed I was going to use any of it. I didn't set out and go like, I'm going to be a conductor now, and I never took conducting lessons with anyone. I have no degree in conducting. I just did the sort of the core courses that were in a music ed program. And then of course you do your student teaching and you do some conducting there, and that's kind of fun and things like that. And I found that when I got the job here, I thought I was just going to be the tuba euphonium teacher. And at that point I was helping as sort of an assistant director with the marching band. I worked with the brass and did a lot for like 5 or 6 years. I did that. But I was told when I got in, they were like, oh yeah, and you're going to be the conductor of the brass ensemble here. And I was like, okay, that's, thank you for telling me that up front.
Yeah.
And so I took on something that I had been involved with as a student, particularly as a high school student. I played in this kind of regional brass ensemble in the Northern Virginia area called Brass of Peace. And there's like all these really well-known professional musicians who went through this ensemble, you know, people playing in major orchestras and are soloists. It's incredible when I look back at it. But I kind of took my love for the ensemble itself, and that's what probably sustained me not making a complete fool of myself,
Yeah.
having to stand in front of musicians and conduct. But I did that with the brass ensemble here for 15 years, I think it was. And then basically moved it into a different type of brass ensemble, which is the brass band that we now have, about 20 years ago. And obviously do quite a bit of that. I mean, I have groups outside of the university that I work with, and I'm asked to come and sort of clinic other groups. But I think that people like having me come in maybe because I really enjoy doing it. I don't think of myself as a conductor, I guess, but I love conducting. I don't strike myself like when someone says, "What do you do?" I'll say I conduct a brass band, but I don't say I'm a conductor.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a difference, but that's just me, because I look at conducting as like tuba playing. It's like this musical outlet, but the thing itself is not as, I mean, it's very rewarding. As a matter of fact, it's now one of my very favorite things to do. But it is because of the connection and the music making and the collaboration.
Yeah.
So that's probably my detour, but it's not really one, because I still do the other stuff, I suppose.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that is interesting, because I don't think that I've actually ever thought of you as a conductor either.
Yeah.
But I mean, I had to observe you for a conducting class because you do it. So.
And I always chuckle a little bit when everybody comes and observes me for conducting class, and I know they're taking notes, and I'm like,
Yeah.
well, whatever you're seeing,
I taught myself this, so.
if you like what I'm doing, good. And if not, I'm sorry, but that's that's sort of, because I've never done seminars or things with conductors. I mean, I've thought about it would be kind of fun just getting a little input that way, but I feel fairly effective with what I'm doing. And I think the ensembles that I get to work with, I think everybody's kind of buys into it. So if I have some shortcomings, they don't seem to mind them too much. So we kind of get past that if there's something there that maybe isn't quite as polished, I guess,
I mean, you have all the tools, and then you have that direct. I feel like it's more of a director situation where you know exactly what you want out of the music. So yeah,
maybe so, but yeah, I mean, it's something I love doing. And so that's like the big addition in my career that has become, that's probably 50% of what I think I do now. But unfortunately, it doesn't mean that I've actually lowered the amount of the other stuff. It's just like I've added that much more on top of it. Yeah.
Just don't know a lot about brass instruments. Being a tuba and euphonium professor is normal, right?
It's fairly normal nationwide, particularly at the time that I was hired.
Okay.
For a university to hire a tuba player that will also teach euphonium, if that's what your kind of question would be.
Yeah.
Because there weren't, and there still are not, there's only a few places in the country that have full-time designated euphonium teachers. And there are places now that have euphonium players that were hired who also learned to play tuba. But generally, university-wise, with the faculty brass quintets, they're going to want to hire someone who plays tuba. So now is more the norm for people, particularly in their advanced, like their doctoral degrees. If they're a euphonium player, they're going to try and pick up some tuba to be viable enough. I think a lot of universities are looking at that a little bit differently now.
Okay.
But in my case, I don't know if you were, if you're asking about, do I play both instruments?
Sure.
I really am not, I don't consider myself a euphonium player. I play, and it's mostly I've not spent as much time as some people do, maybe more in a more contemporary setting now. People will really take time to learn that instrument. But I felt like the successes of the euphonium players that I've had has not been hindered by the fact that I'm really a tuba player, because I feel like I'm doing more than just teaching that one specific instrument.
Yeah. It fits with your teaching philosophy, I guess.
Right. Yeah. And I think, if I played the euphonium really adeptly and played it really well, I think it could be something that would be enhancing to the overall experience for them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I will play more often for younger students that I have, because, the really accomplished older students, they can play euphonium far better than I play euphonium. I mean, in terms of that.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't feel, again, like I said, that it's detrimental to what they're doing, because we're really, of course, working on something that's more important than just euphonium playing.
Yeah.
Yeah. What, I looked through your quotes, and I have a quote that I like that I wanted to give you.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
And it's not a musician who did this,
Okay.
but I sometimes, and do you know who Ken Blanchard is?
I don't think so.
He's like 80 some, or almost 90 now, and he's in business. He's a businessman, and he does a lot of seminars and various things like that. I think he has a book called The 1 Minute Manager, like one of these things. And all right. And this is a quote that I have used most particularly with ensembles that I work with. And I also use it when people express a lot of desire and enthusiasm for something, but sometimes their desire and enthusiasm is not paying off in results for them.
Mm-hmm.
And the quote is, and it's Blanchard, so it's Blanchard, Ken Blanchard. He says, there's a difference between interest and commitment. When you're interested in doing something, you do it only when it's convenient. When you're committed to something, you accept no excuses, only results. And that's sort of hardcore in a way when I read it. And I don't say this to anybody sort of like I'm bringing the hammer down, like I don't care, don't give me any excuses, I only want this. But what I use this one for is I try and get students to understand the difference between being interested in something.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm interested in astronomy,
mm-hmm. but
I don't do that as a profession. I don't do research, but I am interested in it. But sometimes I'm not interested in it, and I'd rather watch Netflix or something.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm not going to do astronomy, right?
Yeah.
But being committed to something is basically saying you're trying to raise that something to another level for yourself. You're trying to say that you're going to put almost your everything into that. Now, I don't ignore my family and my wife because I conduct and I play the tuba, but it's saying that to me, that quote, in my interpretation, is not trying to make excuses for why something didn't work well. I have to really then start looking at, well, am I really committed to this project that I'm doing? And sometimes some projects are worth putting a little bit of extra time in it, where you might be a little more tired the next morning.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that it has to be the way of my life, 12 months out of the year, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I don't think that's who I am, because I think there's other things in my life that I think require that balance of work and family and faith and all those things. But I think as people, and particularly for my students, that a lot of times we're very interested in a lot of different things.
Yeah.
But we're not as committed about any one thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what challenges us to be able to get better at something, particularly if we're talking about music and music performance. There is a level of commitment that has to go into it.
Mm-hmm.
If I have to, as a student, I had to show up to the parties an hour or two later than everybody else because I was still going to practice or whatever, just those little things, and being able to make the priorities happen, so that if it's really a commitment of yours, you need to be able to sort of state that in your actions.
Mm-hmm.
And I know it's not a musical thing, but it is a thing that to me that speaks to sort of someone's passion about something,
mm-hmm.
and then turning that passion into a pathway and a commitment to being able to do something really well.
Yeah.
Or as completely as you want to be able to do it, I
mm-hmm.
guess, And I think for a lot of my students, sometimes that's a hard quote to hear.
Yeah.
It's interesting, you have students audition, we had our auditions, and I'm in touch with all these new students that'll be coming to school, mm-hmm. hopefully, if everything works out next year, right? And it's interesting, sometimes I'll have a student come in who ends up very enthusiastic when they get here, and eventually ends up in business or mathematics or psychology or whatever else. And I want people to be successful and happy and fulfilled and interested, whatever field they're going in. So the minute someone's in my studio, I don't get my fingers in them trying to keep them no matter what. But I think what people find out is that when they were in high school as musicians, they had great interest in band. And when they get to college, they find out they didn't have a commitment to music. Because, for them, it spoke to the fact that band was all their musical life when they were younger. And then band becomes only a wee fraction of their musical life as a music major. And that's, oftentimes where that quote comes up. And I tell people it's okay to have a really great hobby or a really great interest. It doesn't mean that as a person you're going to ever stop expressing yourself, but maybe commitment wise, you're really cut out because you should be in nursing, or maybe you want to be an accountant. I don't know. But, to find that level of being committed to something doesn't mean that if you're only interested in something, you're a failure. It just means that you're just doing interest when you have time and when you have availability to do it.
That definitely gives a lot of good perspective, I think, for undergrad students to think about, because I do see a lot of music majors, as you do, come in and I think realize that it's not all about having fun, and then but the interest versus commitment is a really good way to think about it.
Yeah, I'm glad you like that. I mean, it isn't all about having fun, isn't it? And sometimes it's not fun at all.
Yeah.
But the thing is that's an interesting statement to say that, because to me, being fulfilled as a musician doesn't mean I always had fun. Sometimes there's something quintessentially more important than just the fun of it. And I think sometimes that's hard for people to kind of wrap their head around a little bit too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
You're welcome. It's a real pleasure.
I had a great time talking with Professor Stees, and his wife, Rhonda Stees, actually was my very first oboe teacher. To keep up with the podcast, you can follow the Instagram page at Detours in Music Podcast, the YouTube channel Detours in Music Podcast, and on my website, which is laurarupeloboe.weebly.com. Feel free to subscribe, comment, like, and share the podcast, or email us at the Detours in Music Podcast at gmail.com. See you next time. Thanks.